my witches and wizards. This is Professor Rowan, and we are coming to you today to finish Harry Potter and the Natural 20. We've been reading this book for months. And tonight is the finale. Hello, Miss Bratface. Welcome. I'm glad you're here. Glad you're going to be here for the finale. I'm so excited. All right. Sorry. Focus. Need focus. Oh, don't worry. It's a story I'm sure you're familiar with. It's just got a slight tweak. For those of you who haven't found Harry Potter and the Natural 20, it's Harry Potter and D&D mashup. If anyone's curious, Cindy C. Wolfpack is referencing the game that we are doing on Thursdays. I am game mastering or storytelling a game of Fate with C. Wolfpack, Shanna, Lynette, which is Wizard PhD, and the Pink Ravenclaw herself, Bella. So, yeah, it was a lot of fun last night. And I am really looking forward to next game. I'm looking forward to tormenting my poor, unfortunate souls. When last we left our intrepid explorers, Milo and Hermione and Ron were rushing to help Harry. Harry and Professor Quirrell had gone into well, Milo believes it as a dungeon crawl, to go find the Philosopher's Stone, or the Sorcerer's Stone if you're here in the US. So Harry has been convinced by Quirrell that they have to go and get the stone because he believes Milo is dying, and that the stone is going to be the only way to save him. Milo, however, is not dying. He was able to successfully escape the Malfoys, and is with Hermione and Ron rushing to his aid. They have gotten through all of the, what's the word I'm looking for? Traps, puzzles, all of the rooms except the last one. And it does look like 2 of them are going to be going through the door. Instead of, originally it was just the one, Harry. But now, 2 of them, because Milo's robes are flame resistant. The last chapter was entitled Troll Wanted, Dead or Alive, because they came into the room with the troll and it had been killed by Quirrell. And now we are in chapter 31, The Man with 2 Faces. Try harder. Look at the mirror and think about the good and the healing you could do with it. Your friend is counting on you. I'm trying, Professor. I can see myself using the stone to cure Milo, but nothing else is happening. Are you sure this is how it works? Milo landed with a roll on the far side of the fire, feeling his hit points drop by 1. Just his luck that the fire, which turned out to be rather ordinary after all, rolled a 6 for damage. Smooth, dark wood in his left hand, right hand ready for casting, Milo quickly took stock of the room in the way that only an adventurer could. Fine details were simultaneously ignored and calculated for gold piece value. Plot-relevant details were filed away for future reference, and threats were evaluated immediately. The sum value of all unattended items in the Stark room was a paltry 37 gold piece, 4 silver, and 7 copper, not counting a rather familiar mirror that he deliberately avoided looking straight at. Standing in front of the mirror of Irisyd was a surprised-looking Harry, who was staring at the newcomers in astonishment. In a flash, Quirrell had his wand out and was standing directly behind the still amazed Harry. Not good, Milo thought. Quirrell could kill all 3 of them before Milo could get a single spell off, most likely. Best get him talking. Every villain worth his black robe and skull necklace likes to monologue. So, you've been trying to get at the stone this whole time, have you? Milo asked. I asked around. You've been teaching Muggle studies at Hogwarts for 4 years before you got the defense job. Were you just waiting, gaining the trust of everyone around you? The specific words were unimportant to his plan. All that mattered was that he got Coral talking. You fool! Good start. When they start calling people fools, it generally means they're working their way up to a magnificent rant. You think you have any inkling of my plan? Well, it was all Milo could do not to smile. Since you're going to kill us anyways, could you at least tell me what the deal was with the acromantula in the Forbidden Forest back in the fall? Milo had been dying to figure out what that was all about. Me too. Harry stood with his hands up. Coral's wand pointed at his temples. You were supposed to die, Coral said. You knew too much. You even told me, said it was obvious to anyone with a brain that you, your friends, and Dumbledore had figured it out. So kind of you to bring them here, by the way. Everyone except that Granger girl, anyway. Milo blinked. Figured what out? He could barely remember the conversation having taken place, much less the subject matter. So I let that half-breed oaf find out I was killing the unicorns in the forest to get you out in the forest alone. It was perfect. The spider would kill you and make it look like an accident. Very tragic, I'd say. What a promising student you were. Quirrell was killing the unicorns? And now he's trying to get the stone. What was it Milo had said? That there were likely followers of Voldemort out there, each competing to bring their master back? So Quirrell wasn't just trying to get the stone for himself. He was a Death Eater as well. But you didn't count on me to kill it? Milo asked. Except he hadn't killed it. Investigation had shown that the injuries he dealt it weren't nearly severe enough to finish the monster off. Everything pointed to a killing curse. You think you killed it? Fool! It was me! Quirrell hesitated a second. I'd sworn never to mention this again, but seeing as how I'm going to kill you anyways. Milo couldn't help himself. He leaned a little closer. I tripped. Quirrell paused, and Milo heard Ron fighting down a laugh. I was watching under the cloak of a disillusionment spell when I slipped. The ground was unnaturally slippery. Milo grinned despite himself. He'd cast a grease spell, but hadn't imagined that he'd managed to get the end boss with it. And the acromantula heard me. I had no choice but to abort the plan, kill the spider, and obliviate you. But you had plenty of opportunities to try again, Milo pointed out. Why didn't... Oh, I see. After I told you how my magic works, you realized that I could be used to revive Voldemort. Don't speak his name, Quirrell shouted. You know who then. So you changed gears. The dueling club, the vampires, they weren't to kill me. They were to get me XP. That was so backwards it almost hurt Milo's head. You wanted me to level up, to turn me into a philosopher's stone. It was one plan of many. Quirrell shrugged, though Milo noticed his wand remained pointed directly at Harry's head. It never hurts to make backups. So, Milo could practically hear the gears whirling inside his head. It was like a scaled-down Monachus in there. You're also the one who possessed Hannah and me, I take it? He asked in a deceptively cool voice. For a Death Eater, you seem awfully afraid of your own master. You flinch every time anyone says Voldemort. You think I am a Death Eater? Quirrell said incredulously. You haven't realized anything yet. One follower of Voldy is much like another, Milo shrugged. I don't know and frankly don't care if you have some sort of internal naming scheme or hierarchy. You're all just XP waiting to be collected when it comes down to it. While Milo was speaking, Quirrell reached up with his offhand and began unwrapping his turban. Milo was unconcerned. It wasn't until the professor's wand hand began moving that he had anything to worry about. At worst, he was trying to activate some sort of magic item, and from what Milo had seen, the local magic items were mainly to aid in household activities. At worst, all potatoes in a 60-foot radius would magically peel themselves. I am so much more than a mere Death Eater, Quirrell sneered, the turban falling to the floor. Harry cried out in pain suddenly, his hand going to his forehead. It came away bloody. I am the avatar of the Dark Lord himself. A horrible hissing voice that seemed to come from Quirrell, though his mouth never moved, spoke suddenly. Kill the newcomers. We only need the boy. Quirrell's wand came up, but Milo was faster. Nerve skitter, Milo said in harmony with himself as he bended around him, speeding his reflexes up slightly. Though a minor difference, all things considered, it was enough. So you're Lord Voldemort, eh? Milo raised his right hand, palm outspread and ready to cast. They say you once murdered an entire family of muggles. The entire family! Cousins, cousins-in-law, grandparents, nieces, nephews, everyone bearing the same surname. They say you did it just because a 20-year-old and his new wife had a witch, a mudblood, for a daughter. They say you're more demon than man, that you sold your soul for dark powers. Some say you never had a soul to begin with. They say that merely saying your name aloud is enough to call your attention. Milo stared at the man standing in front of him, the man he had once trusted. Maybe he really was part demon, but templates come at the cost of all important caster levels. But people say a lot of foolish things. Once I heard a bard reason that since wearing heavy armor reduced his hide bonus, going absolutely naked would render him invisible. To an outside observer, it would seem remarkable that Voldemort would wait for Milo to continue before completing his spell. However, said outside observer was likely unaware that talking is a free action, and Milo could have recited the Raven in its entirety before allowing anyone else to act. Really, when it comes down to it, your vaunted dark magic is about as useful as a fallen paladin without your wand, Milo said. It would be a shame if it were to unexpectedly, say, shatter. A noise like an elder worm roaring echoed through the room, and Quirrell's altar wand exploded into splinters. Harry, taking advantage of the confusion, dashed away from the mirror to join Ron and Milo. Well, Quirrell stammered, something felt wrong. Very wrong. It would appear that I have been beaten. Milo blinked, then realized what it was. He hadn't gotten any XP from Quirrell. Quirrell wasn't defeated. Then he remembered what happened after the first time he'd seen the Mirror of Erised. 12 sapient creatures. Quirrell counts as 2, leaving 10 unaccounted for. Glitter Dust! Milo cast the spell, not at Quirrell, but directly to his right. Milo's primary usage of the spell was generally to blind everyone in the area, but this time He wanted it for its other purpose, revealing invisible creatures. Sparkly arcane doom rained down, revealing 5 small, heavily armed creatures that Milo was all too familiar with. Redcaps. Invisible redcaps. Crap. The golden particles outlined the invisible creatures, each carrying a heavy sword like the one in the Forbidden Forest had. Milo guessed, though he doubted he could push Coral into another rant to confirm it, that one had been sent by the professor. No, by Voldemort, as part of his level grind the PC plan. The outlined ones will only be visible for 42 seconds, Milo shouted to Ron and Harry. Stun as many as you can. I'll deal with the other 5. Right, Ron said. Stun them with what, exactly? I don't know, stupefy or something. But that's a 4th year. Just figure something out. 3 of the 5 glowing redcaps had been blinded by the golden light, but the other 2 were advancing rapidly towards them. Milo could only guess what the other 5 were up to, but fortunately, this was the fight he was made for. Enough of that one-on-one insanity. Battlefield control was a conjurer's specialty. Web. Thick, sticky webs appeared in the area that Milo guessed the still invisible redcaps were standing. The beauty of the web spell is that even if the targets manage to make their reflex saves, it doesn't really help them all that much. They still get a host of penalties and requires an extremely difficult strength check to move at all, and even then, extremely slowly. That, and at Milo's level, it lasts for over an hour. It is generally considered the pinnacle of the Conjuration School, and on top of all of that, it's only a 2nd level spell. Milo could hear screams of frustration from the trapped redcaps, but that was no guarantee that he'd caught all 5. Can you smell any others? Milo asked his familiar. Rats have a keen sense of smell, which is one of the reasons that he had picked Morty as his companion. Morty sniffed the air for a second, then nodded.
11 o'clock, 20 feet, 1 straggler.
Grease. The thud and metal-on-stone clatter confirmed the hit. Grease would only delay the redcap, not trap it entirely like Webb would. Milo glanced around to see how his companions were faring. Expelliarmus! Harry shouted, and one of the redcap's swords went flying behind him. Wingardium Leviosa! Ron cast immediately afterwards, catching the sword in midair and lifting it up over another's head, dropping it, hilt first, from 5 feet up. The redcap moved to dodge, but was too slow and went down like a sorcerer hit by a great club. With one redcap disarmed, another unconscious, and the other 3 still blind, there didn't seem to be any immediate threats, but Milo doubted that would last. Mirror image, he cast, and 6 doppelgangers appeared around him. The unarmed redcap didn't seem to know when it was beaten, and lunged at Ron, his golden hands clenching around the red-headed boy's throat. Crap! Milo was out of attack spells except for Acid Splash, and he didn't even want to know what kind of penalties could be incurred by shooting into a grapple. He started running down through a list of divinations he could cast spontaneously that might be helpful, but Harry was faster. Expelliarmus! Ron went flying, out of the redcap's hands. Brilliant, Milo thought. Expelliarmus knocks away whatever the target is holding, not just wands. Harry was already starting to think like a munchkin. Milo would never admit it, but he felt somewhat proud of his party member. Glitter dust didn't provide enough detail for Milo to be sure, but he imagined the look of dumbfounded astonishment on the ugly Fae's face. It was then that Milo had an idea. Hey, Ugly! Milo shouted at the unarmed redcap. Worried about your lack of weapon? A real redcap doesn't need one. After all, I killed your buddy unarmed back in the Forbidden Forest. Milo couldn't tell if the Fae understood a word he said, but it lunged at him nevertheless. The dark wood staff whirled and smashed into the creature's temple with as much force as Milo could manage. So, not a lot when it comes down to it. The creature recovered and attempted futilely to punch Milo through the protection of his robe of arcane might. The bony fist slid off the magically augmented uniform, and Milo attacked again. Milo's bet paid off. He'd gambled that the Redcap hadn't taken the improved unarmed strike feat. Hell, nobody takes improved unarmed strike, and therefore would give Milo a free attack every time he tried to do the same. Despite Milo's slender build and lousy BAB, which is base attack bonus, with a pair of attacks for every punch from the Redcap, combined with his high AC, armor class, and his mischance from mirror image, the Fae didn't stand a chance. As the Redcap fell to Milo's sixth blow, Morty spoke again.
Alert! Enemy approaching at 6 o'clock!
God damn it, Milo thought, whirling around. It must be the one that I greased. He'd completely forgotten about it when he'd gone on in to play Big Stupid Fighter with the other one. One of Milo's doubles flickered and vanished as, presumably, the invisible Redcap slashed at it with his wicked curved sword. Ron and Harry each cast a disarming charm, but without knowing exactly where the Redcap stood, they went wide. This was becoming far too hairy for a wizard as squishy as he was. For a second, Milo considered using Fly to reach the safety of the ceiling, but realized that would leave Harry and Ron, who lacked his, by this world's standards, preternatural healing abilities and resilience, vulnerable. Instead, Milo decided that he'd be better to leave the battle in the hands of a specialist. Summon Halfway through the spell, the Redcap swung again, this time guessing the correct target. Milo tried to dodge, but only succeeded in mitigating the attack somewhat. The sword penetrated the spell-enhanced robes and drew a thick red line along Milo's chest, inflicting a hefty 10 damage. He screamed in pain, and falling to his knees, his concentration shattered. The spell failed. Milo spat blood and looked around the room hazily. Harry and Ron were still futilely shooting disarming spells around the room, trying to catch the invisible Redcap. Quirrell was standing by the mirror, counting silently, of all things. Milo narrowed his eyes and realized what was happening. 39, 40, 41, 42, Milo breathed, terrorizing. The magic sustaining the golden particles surrounding the 5 Redcaps vanished, and they vanished. 2 were unconscious, but the other 3... Normally, Milo would simply spontaneously cast See Invisibility and fly, and then proceed to rain blows upon the Redcaps' heads from above. However, despite having only 2 hit points left, he was still the best defended of this group. Further, from what Milo had noticed, the disillusionment charm didn't make the wearer technically invisible, merely extremely well concealed. As such, See Invisibility would be useless. It was then that Milo noticed a glimmer of movement near the back fire of the doorway. This was unusual, as the Redcaps were all invisible, and both Ron and Harry were nowhere nearby. "Incendio!" he heard a female whisper. A barely noticeable jet of bluebell fire, the same hue as what had been used against the devil's snare, hit a distant corner of Milo's web. Of course. Hermione! She was creeping along the side of the room near the door, with the web spell between her and most of the Redcaps, and Quirrell, blocking vision. "Duck!" Milo shouted. Harry and Ron, too surprised to do anything but comply, hit the ground immediately. The webs began to burn quickly. Magical webs, unlike mundane webs, are highly flammable. As the violet-blue flame spread throughout the faux spider silk, Milo heard Hermione's voice again. "Ventus!" A colossal gust of searing hot air slammed into Milo bodily, knocking him onto his back. This was shortly followed by a raging hot bluebell inferno, as strands of inexplicably inflammable webs were sucked up by the whirlwind and, suddenly oxygenated, exploding into fire. Ventus, 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 Hermione, through clever use of controlled bursts of air, managed to direct the flame to a certain extent, causing it to avoid Harry and Ron. Milo's magic robes protected him, and Morty, with improved evasion, had little to worry about. But the Redcaps had no such luck. As the fires began to die out, Hermione threw both glass bottles of wine from the potions riddle into the middle of it, the alcohol spilling out as the containers shattered. Redcaps scream in agony as their clothes and hair burned in the suddenly refueled inferno. Merlin's beard! Ron breathed as the fires died down. Invisible burning figures were sprinting around the room, trying to put themselves out. One by one, they began to drop. Milo did some rapid counting. "She only got 5, he shouted. "There's 3 more still conscious." Ron whirled as he heard the sudden cracking of broken glass behind him, caused by the heavy bronze-studded boots the Redcaps favored, crushing the remains of a bottle. "Expellia!" Ron went down as the Fae clubbed him over the head with, fortunately, the hilt of his invisible sword. "You fools thought you could defeat us?" Quirrell laughed. There was something in his voice. Milo cursed his low sense motive bonus yet again. That seemed a little off. Like he wasn't quite sincere, maybe. "We are..." Frankly, Milo didn't give a damn what Quirrell was going to say. "Fly," he muttered, ripping the amulet of protection from evil from around his neck. Behind him, he saw Hermione spin in surprise and start casting something, but the wand was knocked from her hand by an unseen attacker. She started to back up, but was pushed to the ground, struggling. "Wah!" Milo roared and flew towards Quirrell, knocking the professor from his feet into the mirror of Iriside, which was made of sterner stuff than it looked. The man-sized mirror fell to the ground with a crash, and Milo and Quirrell came tumbling down on top of it. As they struggled, Milo noticed with revulsion that there was another face on Quirrell's head, normally hidden by his turban. A face with snake-like eyes and slits for a nose. "Mind on the task," he reminded himself, trying to pin Quirrell to the ground. This next task would take all of his mental ability and concentration. Grappling, first an attack of opportunity, which Quirrell was denied, being caught flat-footed by Milo's sudden attack, though Milo was fairly sure that the local wizards hadn't even heard of attack of opportunities anyways. Then, what was it? A touch attack? Milo clumsily grabbed the downed wizard. An easy task. Quirrell was unarmored and not particularly agile, while Milo had his, again, by the low standards of his competition, superior melee talents, augmented by the +2 bonus for the charge. Then, Milo racked his brain to try to remember the ridiculously complicated rules. There was what, an opposed grapple check? He struggled to wrap the amulet around Quirrell's neck as the fully grown man resisted with vastly superior strength and size, albeit inferior skill. "Ha!" Milo gasped. "I got a 16! His fingers struggled to work the clasp on the steel chain. The clasp, which was specifically designed to be difficult to do and undo, and almost felt it click into place when Quirrell threw him off. Milo landed in a heap, astonished, as Quirrell calmly climbed to his feet. Quirrell was holding his wand. Milo blinked, trying to process the image in front of him. Quirrell, no Voldemort, was holding his wand. 13 inches, chestnut wood, dragon heartstring core. Good for curses, Quirrell murmured to himself, testing the wand. Palor above and Neural below, Milo cursed. Trying to use the amulet to cut Voldemort's influence on Quirrell was Milo's last plan. Well, his second to last plan. True strike, he muttered, reaching into his extra-dimensional belt for his knife. He had avoided this Horrific memories of his last use of the dagger flooded into his mind. But now he had no choice. Milo threw the masterwork cold iron dagger in an overhand arc, aimed right for Coral's throat. The image of Hannah's crumpled body entered his mind's eye, but he dismissed it. It had been Voldemort's fault that Hannah had been possessed. Voldemort's fault that Milo had almost killed her with this very dagger, and Voldemort's fault that Milo was in this position once again. Dice rolled in Milo's head as he channeled all of his rage and anguish into this final desperate throw. 20. Milo marveled. Even the DM seemed to be with him for once. Quirrell, and therefore Voldemort, suffered from the same weakness that Hannah had, a remarkable frail physical body. He wouldn't stand a chance. The dagger spun gracefully in the air once, twice, thrice, guided by the unseen force of the famed True Strike spell. Quirrell's wand arm shot upwards without even looking. No! The horrible face on the back of Quirrell's head murmured, and the dagger stopped in midair, halfway between Milo and his target. It hovered there for a moment, then crumpled and fell. No! Milo whispered weakly, his voice barely carrying to his own ears. That's not fair. I call shenanigans. Still, he wasn't done yet. He still had 2 hit points, an active fly spell, and a belt full of tricks. Qual, don't fail me now. All Milo had to do was fly over to Quirrell, drop the feather, and watch as the purple-clad professor was crushed between the ceiling and a rapidly growing oak tree. He grabbed the feather-shaped token in his gloved hand and launched himself into the air, aiming for the space over the defense professor's head. Pontificus totalis, Quirrell muttered. Milo fell like a stone, landing painfully next to Harry, who, like Hermione, had been pinned by invisible hands. Quirrell turned to face them. That is, he looked directly away from Harry, Milo, and Hermione, treating them with a full view of the horror of the back of his head, and began casting, with game-breaking speed, Milo's amulet still clutched in his left hand. Pontificus totalis, Pontificus totalis. Harry and Hermione suddenly stopped fighting against their invisible attackers. Finite incantatem. All 10 redcaps, 5 of them critically injured from burns, 2 unconscious, 2 grappling Hermione and 1 grappling Harry, suddenly became visible. They looked around in surprise, clearly not counting on this unexpected turn of events. Then they began to die. Avada Kedavra, Avada Kedavra, Avada Kedavra. One by one, Quirrell, Voldemort, methodically shot and killed the Fae, all while his expression remaining neutral, almost bored. Horrible creatures. The voice said in a strained, snake-like hiss. Still, not quite as useless as some of the servants I had to deal with recently. Milo was unsure if the weird pauses in his dialogue were a dramatic affliction or a result of his unnatural half-life. Disappointingly, I have guessed incorrectly about the nature of this mirror. Voldemort waved his hand lazily, and the mirror of Erised turned to dust, scattering about the room. It being a puzzle created by that sentimental fool, I assumed one such as him. Quirrell glanced at Harry, and for once the glimmer of emotion was visible in his snake-like eyes. In all, Milo was happier before knowing that the Dark Lord looked like when he filled with barely uncontrollable rage. Would be able to crack it. Some sort of frame of mind, perhaps benevolence, or a desire to do good. Alas, but fortune favors me again. Voldemort paused to gasp for air. Milo wondered, briefly, how the internals, so to speak, of the Quirrell and Voldemort setup worked. Where the esophagus went and such, before deciding that he did not want to know. It seems that my so-called downfall has been delivered directly to my hands. The tips of Voldemort's mouth went upwards into a horrific semblance of a grin, and Milo decided that he preferred wrath to pleasure on that horrific face. "Blood of the enemy," he murmured, though Milo wasn't sure what he meant by that. "Oh, and Crucio." Harry screamed, straining against the bonds of his full-body bind curse. His scar started bleeding as his body was racked with the worst pain imaginable that magic could produce. Milo had once been the target of a power word pain spell, but this looked significantly worse. And now, young Milo, I no longer have need of your specialized abilities. Avada Kedavra. Click. As soon as Voldemort started casting with his right hand, Quirrell's left hand reached around his neck and snapped the amulet of protection from evil into place. There was a brief moment of silence, and then Voldemort, or Quirrell, collapsed to the ground. The magical bonds trapping Milo and the others vanished. Harry said, "Did Voldemort just finish himself off?" Hermione, meanwhile, rushed over to check on Ron, who was blearily regaining consciousness. "A bit anticlimactic, if you ask me," Milo said. "Still, could be some sort of trick." "Yeah," Harry said, climbing to his feet shakily. "Trick us into thinking that he's tricking us into thinking he's dead by offing himself? Brilliant, that is. Well, we saw it through his cunning ploy. Go team." Mage hand. Milo floated his wand away from Quirrell, then quickly drew his 11-foot pole. Sometimes you just need that extra foot, and prodded the body gently. There was no response. "Huh. Well, it looks like we got him. Time to loot the corpses." His companions looked at him, a mix of shock and revulsion on their faces, as he patted down the red caps for loose change. Not finding any, he settled on for pocketing their swords in his belt of hidden pouches and proceeded to the real prize, the boss. "I think this went rather well," Milo said happily, walking over to Quirrell. "We stopped the Philosopher's Stone from being stolen, defeated the Dark Lord Voldemort once and for all, sort of, maybe, rescued the princess." Milo nodded at Harry, ignoring his, "Hey! And we don't even need to shell out for a single true resurrection. Not bad, all things considered. All that remains is to divvy up the loot." Holy crap, he's breathing! Quirrell, it appeared, was merely unconscious, but of the face on the back of his head, there was no sign, merely a normal, but shaved, scalp. Milo reached for the amulet around Quirrell's neck, but decided against it. For all he knew, it was the only thing keeping Voldemort at bay. Still, he patted down Quirrell's pockets nonetheless. Not much, really, when it came down to it. Just a few sickles, some garlic, a holy symbol, and a tattered old book. "Hello!" Milo exclaimed, turning over the shabby, leather-bound diary. There was a faded date on the cover. Milo did some arithmetic and figured it was just over 50 years old. "What have we here? Book of Evil Plans? Tome of Clear Thought? Book of Spells? Let's find out." Scholar's touch. Milo paused for a second while the spell read the book in its entirety. "Huh. It's empty. That's unexpected." As far as treasure goes, this kind of sucks. Behind him, Ron blearily stood up. Maybe it really is just an old book, Hermione suggested. We can ask Quirrell when he wakes up. No, just wait. Ron, you really shouldn't be moving around yet. Can I see it? Ron asked groggily. Sure, Milo said, tossing it over to him. Ron flipped through a few pages. Anyone know who T.M. Riddle is? Seeing them all shake their heads, Ron pocketed the book. What? He said defensively. Ginny will be starting school next year. She'll need a notebook. Ron was always self-conscious of his family's wealth, or lack thereof, and parchment was kind of expensive by non-PC standards anyway, so Milo let the issue drop. We should probably grab the professor and work our way backwards through the challenges, Harry suggested. We really should tell Dumbledore about all this. Hermione paled. We are in so much trouble, she said. We broke into the expressly forbidden third-floor corridor. She paused for a second, and then nearly killed the Defense Against the Dark Arts professor. We have an even bigger problem than that, Milo said. How in the nine hells do we get out? The black fire was still guarding the door. They all looked at him. Milo sighed. Fine. He proceeded to wade through the flames, grab the little black bottle, carry it out again, have someone drink it and walk back, wait for it to replenish, and then wade through the fire again. Rinse and repeat for his 3 companions and Quirrell, who was still unconscious. They had to pour the bottle down his throat and hope for the best, though to be honest, none of them cared that much if he was trapped down there or not. Then again for the purple flames. The whole process took more than an hour, but blessedly was time skipped. Milo was far too distracted, thinking up what to do with his new level. Chapter 32, The Dumble-denouement. Tell me again why you carry a grappling hook at all times, mate? Ron asked, giving Milo's silk rope a hefty tug. He had an ugly bruise on his temple, and likely an assortment of minor injuries, but was otherwise okay. And a rope, for that matter? It came in handy, didn't it? Milo pointed between poles. Every adventurer has at least 50 feet of rope. Some carry hundreds. Getting back up the shaft that led to the devil's snare seemed, at first, an insurmountable problem, until Milo remembered that he still had rope in his belt. Hermione levitated it up to the surface and latched the grappling hook onto the heavy cast iron ring the trapdoor used as a handle. Climbing up wasn't exceptionally difficult. A rope with a wall to brace against was a mere DC 5 with a 10-point reduction for having a wall to brace against. A paraplegic triple amputee could make that check. No, the hard part was getting the still unconscious Professor Quirrell to the top. In the end, they simply tied the rope around his waist and shoulders and decided to pull him up. Reckon we could have just left him there, Harry muttered. Oh, wrong accent, but still. He still looked pale and shaky from Quirrell's torture spell, but hadn't mentioned it. The others decided to drop it, though Hermione gave him the occasional concerned look. He's a Hogwarts professor, Hermione sounds scandalized. We can't just leave him. We could have told McGonagall or Dumbledore, and they would have gone down and got him. Besides, he did try to kill us all. Hermione made a sound, but dropped the issue. It took several more minutes, but they eventually got Quirrell's limp body up to the room where Fluffy once stood. You know, Ron mused as he grabbed the professor by the shoulders and dragged him onto the floor. We likely could have just levitated him like Hermione did the rope. He's far too heavy, Hermione pointed out. For all 3 of us at once, Ron asked. It wouldn't have taken a moment. Harry, Hermione, and Milo stared at him for a few seconds in total silence. Hermione opened her mouth like she was going to speak, then fell silent. Why me? She asked, and nobody in particular. I, for one, can think of no witch more suited to the task, someone said from the doorway. Milo, keenly aware that he only had 5 hit points remaining, because he'd gained 3 upon leveling up, not to mention no spells more powerful than Acid Splash, warily turned to the door. "Professor," Harry said in relief. In the doorway was none other than Professor Dumbledore, still dressed in the same purple robes he'd worn to Lucius's manor. "Indeed, that is my chosen vocation. Quick as always, Mr. Potter. Now could someone please illuminate to me as what in Merlin's name is going on in my school?" Everyone spoke at once. "Voldemort, Lucius, please don't tell my mum. Oh, I know you said we weren't to enter the Forbidden Corridor, but—" Dumbledore simply waited patiently while they all told the story as they saw it, beginning at different times and frequently in backwards, frontwards, and occasionally sidewards order. "So you mean to say that Quirius, while under the sway of Voldemort, led young Milo out into the forest where a group of masked men, led by Lucius Malfoy, intercepted them, inadvertently foiling the plans of their incognito master, captured Milo, disapparated back to the manor only to have Milo escape and return to Hogwarts, while the defense professor took Harry, under the false pretenses of needing his help to rescue Milo, who needed no help, it appears, after all, to find the Philosopher's Stone, assuming that Harry would be able to breach whatever defenses I had placed, only to be foiled by Milo, Ron, and Hermione." Was that all one sentence, Professor?" Milo asked in awe, partly out of the feat of linguistics, but mainly that the headmaster had managed to listen to all 4 of them simultaneously. Probably comes from a supernaturally extended lifetime of teaching teenagers. Also, yes, that's pretty much how it happened. "Very well," Dumbledore sighed, and gestured for them to follow him. "I think perhaps it would be best if we return to my office to discuss this matter further." "Where were you?" Harry asked en route. There was a faint accusatory note in his voice. "The Ministry," Dumbledore said. "The reasons for which should become clear once we reach my office." The mild rebuke was enough to make Harry look at his feet and remain silent for the rest of the short, winding walk. Upon entering the office, Dumbledore sat down on his customary chintz armchair, and his fingers forming a steeple in front of him, spoke. "I assume you have questions," he said. "I will, if at all possible, answer them within the best of my ability. But first to answers Harry's. I was at the Ministry. After I was tipped off by a certain trusted source that Milo was held within one of the Malfoy's estates, I wasted no time in informing friends within the Department of Magical Law Enforcement and assisting in what is, I believe, generally called a raid. Incidentally, this was also my first clue as to Professor Quirrell's deception. He came to me with his story that Milo was held by vampires. I did not, however, realize the full extent of the situation until well later. By that point, I was bogged down with what I dare say was a tremendous quantity of paperwork. It appears that deploying orders without warning against one of the more well-respected members of the community of magical Britain is not without cost." "So they caught Malfoy, then?" Milo was surprised. He hadn't thought that their scuffle in the manor would be the last they'd see of him. There were too many unanswered questions for that. "Alas, no," Dumbledore sighed. "Officially, a pair of deranged wizards attempting to revive the criminal organization, known as the Death Eaters, broke into Malfoy's residence in an attempt to punish him for his betrayal at the end of the war. Their actions were, it appears, independent and without support from others." "But that's not true," Harry insisted. "He was one of them. You have to believe us." "Oh, I do, dear boy. But that doesn't change the fact that it will take more substantial evidence for the Ministry to mobilize in full. In the meantime, be comforted in knowing that there are those within the Ministry who are working diligently, and unfortunately secretly, to uncover the truth of the matter." Harry didn't look particularly happy, but he let the matter rest. "I have a question, Headmaster," Ron interjected. "How did you-know-who get to be on the back of another bloke's head?" "Unicorn's blood," Dumbledore said sadly. It can be used to prolong one's life almost indefinitely, but at the cost of being doomed to living an unnatural half-life." "Unnatural is bloody right," Ron muttered. Sorry, Professor." "Not to worry," the professor said. "I was momentarily distracted by a delightful passing bluebird, and seemed to have missed everything you said just then." Right. So," Harry said slowly, "is he gone then? Voldemort?" "I'm afraid not," Dumbledore said gravely. "I don't know if it will be a year or 10, but I can be certain that he will return." "How could you know?" Milo asked. "There's no telling the crazy results when our forms of magic interact. Mind, he's obviously not gone. It's the only thing that makes sense. He has to be the final boss, and this was hardly final. But still, by you people's standards of logic, the amulet may well have finished him off." "While that may be a possibility," Dumbledore admitted, "harboring it would reduce our vigilance for his return. In general, I have found that, when it comes to dealing with Voldemort, it is best to hope for the best, prepare for the worst, and when it comes to it, expect even worse than that." "But also, young Milo, I have access to certain sources that you do not." "Fair enough," Milo admitted. "Now what happens to the defense professor?" "That depends," Dumbledore admitted. "I will have to talk to him when he wakes. The question to determine is to what amount he was a willing supporter of Voldemort, and what amount he was a slave. Based on your stories, it appears that he deliberately took action to expel Voldemort's spirit from his body, which implies it was some of the former. I can scarcely imagine living a life such as that." "Oh?" Harry asked, curious. "To my limited understanding of the process, Professor Quirrell's resident, so to speak, had the power to read the professor's mind directly. Any plan that Professor Quirrell developed could be immediately detected by Voldemort, who could, and knowing him would, punish his servant severely." "Are you suggesting that Quirrell had to develop and execute his plan without, at any step along the way, consciously thinking about it?" Milo asked incredulously. "Is that even possible?" Hermione was stunned. "I will need to speak with him to be certain, but it would appear to be so," Dumbledore responded. "It is entirely possible that he set up the entire chain of events that led to him getting his hands on Milo's amulet deliberately. Or, perhaps more likely, he seized on the opportunity provided by his master's distracted state, caused by the brave young Mr. Potter here. Whatever the case, it still remains to be determined whether or not he was, well, evil?" Harry suggested. "In essence. If so, I shall turn him over to the ministry without delay. But if not, I might consider offering him a teaching position. There is, however, one thing I can say for certain." "And what's that?" Milo asked. "Come next term, he will no longer be the defense professor." "How do you know?" Hermione asked. "Call it an old man's intuition," Dumbledore smiled. "I have a question, Professor," Hermione said. "What will you do with the Philosopher's Stone now? And for that matter, where is it?" "Ah," Dumbledore said with a mischievous grin, "it was in the mirror all along. However, I had bewitched it, only to give it to someone who wanted the stone, but not to use it." "So he was right," Milo exclaimed. "You had set the mirror up as some kind of elaborate test of character." And I failed? Harry asked. Wait. He looked at the headmaster for a second, and then suddenly laughed. He sabotaged himself. Excuse me? Hermione asked. He guessed it was a test of character, but he told me that he needed the stone to save Milo, Harry explained. So you wanted to use it, Milo said, grinning. You were desperate to. Indeed, Dumbledore said. And as for the stone, it is not fully my decision to make. I'll send word to Nicholas Flamel, and together we will decide what is best. However, I think that, for now, it would be best if you all went to see Poppy in the hospital wing. As they turned to leave, he added, Except for you, Mr. Anastasia Liadon. Milo sat down as the others left, feeling somewhat concerned. What's up? He asked. I believe it has come time for us to discuss what to do about you. Oh? Milo said apprehensively. Well, the simple fact of the matter is that, forgive me, you don't fully fit in here, Dumbledore said. Your form of magic being all but completely incompatible with that which is taught in this school. I can think of any number of wizarding families that would be happy to have you stay with them until such a time as we can figure out how to return you to your home. Are you kicking me out? Milo was floored. Sure, the magic was different, and he was failing transfiguration and potions, but he'd never imagined that he'd be thrown out like this. Besides, quite frankly, Professor, you're mistaken. Oh? On which issue? Hogwarts is my home, Milo said firmly, and I've never felt that way about anywhere else. Very well, Dumbledore said slowly. I must confess, I had thought you wanted nothing more than to leave, but seeing as that is not the case, you might want to look to your studies. Minerva is your head of house. She is well within her power to expel you for your grades, which, I am told, are somewhat less than dowdy. But I'm doing my best, Milo protested. I can't actually do your magic. How am I supposed to pass? You seem to have managed in at least 4 courses, Dumbledore pointed out. 2 of which have no magic involved whatsoever, he countered, and in charms I got lucky. One of my spells is similar to the hovering charm, which is basically the only actual spell Flitwick taught us. The rest was theory. Thank the gods above and below that he didn't ask me to hover anything sideways, or I'd have been up the sticks without a paddle. Levitate can only move things vertically. I understand, dear boy, I do, but I'm not, quite frankly, certain what I can do about it. You see, currently, I am the only member of the faculty aware of the nature of your powers, though Minerva knows some of it, and Poppy is developing suspicions that you are, in fact, quote, an eldritch horror from beyond time come to sow destruction, unquote. I could inform them, but it would come at the risk of letting your secret get out to the wider world. I see the problem, Milo said reluctantly. I might be able to fake my way through transfiguration. He'd need a week to plan at least, and likely a month of spell research. The other courses are, so far, not much problem, though I suspect at higher levels defense against the dark arts will become less theory and more application, in which case I will be in trouble. But in potions there's nothing I can do. Even if he took the suboptimal brew potion feat, he could still only make his kind of potions, that is to say, arcane potions, which were very specific in their nature, effect, and brewing process. Then there is happily no problem, Dumbledore said broadly. Graduation with a T in potions is perfectly acceptable, though not, of course, strictly encouraged. In fact, I can pass word around that you were strongly traumatized from a young age by certain potions, and as a result, have a severe psychological handicap to overcome. It might make things somewhat easier for you. You wouldn't even be lying, Milo added happily. I'm severely traumatized by potions every time I go into Snape's classroom. Very well. I believe this matter is settled, Dumbledore said with a glint in his eye. Milo was reminded once more that he was speaking to someone considerably wilier than himself, and wondered whether or not this had been the intended outcome of the conversation. Now, I have just one more question for you, Dumbledore said slowly. Yes, Professor? What was your mother's name? Lay Anastasia. The question caught him completely by surprise, and Milo answered without thinking. He stared at Dumbledore for a moment before the nut dropped. Paylor Crowlingord, he exclaimed. My backstory! The moment he said it, he knew that his mother's name was Lay, and could almost picture her face. Dumbledore simply smiled. I think if you move alacritously, you may be able to catch your friends before they reach the hospital ring. If you do see them, could you tell them that all 4 of you earned 50 points for the house each? Oh, and if you could ask Harry to come visit sometime this evening, it would be much appreciated. Thank you, Professor, Milo stammered. He was still too surprised by his sudden discovery to fully process what was going on. His backstory was working again, but it seemed somewhat different from before. Back then, the answers simply appeared as necessary, but now, it was as if Milo had been the one to will them into existence. This warranted further thought and experimentation, but for now, he would just enjoy what had happened. He had to level up. Sooner or later, he'd have to deal with the consequences of beating Malfoy and his mooks senseless, and figure out a plan to turn a matchstick into a pin. But that could hopefully be done another day. As Milo turned to the doorknob, Dumbledore spoke once more. Oh, and Milo, I'm proud of you. Dun 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 denouement. All we have left, my loves, is the epilogue. Okay, before I finish reading the epilogue, I am going to answer the questions. There are sequels. This was just book 1. Book 2 is the Harry Potter book 2 that is called Harry Potter and the Confirmed Critical. And if you are reading along with me on fanfiction.net, if you just hit next, it takes you into the very first chapter of that one. It's going to be in that thing chapter 34, which is chapter 1 of the next book, if that makes sense. But we did it! Huzzah! Round of applause. Epilogue, or the tying of all knots. So Milo does some fairly obscure and convoluted, but not particularly plot-relevant munchkinry in this section. So if you want, there's actually a copy of Milo's character sheet in the website if you would like to look at it. There are 2 epilogues. Epilogue 1, Rebuilding. Honestly, Milo, you should be revising for History of Magic, Hermione chided as Milo stumbled into the Great Hall for breakfast. The exam was less than a fortnight away, but he'd hardly even glanced at his notes. The hall was full of students, with the usual comforting white noise of hundreds of conversations going on in the background. For a time, the only topic of conversation was Professor Quirrell's sudden absence, which continued well after Dumbledore's announcement that he had suffered a nervous breakdown and was recuperating at St. Mungo's, which, as far as Milo could tell, was true. Dumbledore had been as close-mouthed and mysterious about it as he was about everything, however. Eventually, the Hogwarts students had found other topics to amuse themselves. Quidditch. Gryffindor had surprised everyone as the clear leader, with Ravenclaw and Slytherin competing neck-to-neck for second. The upcoming exams, Fred and George's latest hijinks. For Hogwarts had awoken to find one of the legs of every chair in every classroom was shortened by only a quarter of an inch. Nobody could figure out how they'd done it. Various ministry scandals, the illustrious deeds of a Gilderoy Lockhart, and most recently, the death of some Death Eater big shot in Azkaban. In short, as far as Milo was concerned, nothing of relevance. He's wrong. No time, Milo said sleepily. It's almost done. He'd barely slept for weeks. There was too much to do. Spell research, item crafting, and, most recently, a major feat of munchkinry. He discovered that there simply wasn't enough time in a day to do everything that had to be done, and that the only way for him to carry on without keeling over dead was with some magical assistance by way of a dedicated rite. These creatures, a form of homunculus, are cat-sized magical automata, created by spellcasters to help them craft items, both magical and mundane. Milo still had to provide the spells and raw materials worth half the value of the finished product, but the rite could do the actual crafting. This would free up 8 hours a day from Milo's packed schedule for frivolous luxuries, such as sleep and adventuring. However, Milo lacked some of the prerequisites for creating the rite, and so had to, through convoluted means, retrain a number of his class levels to Artificer from Wizard, and then back again. While he was at it, he made a few modifications to his current build. Many of his abilities had been chosen under duress, with very specific needs in mind, needs that no longer existed, and he was in dire need of some streamlining. What is? Neville asked, pouring an unhealthy amount of salt onto his dinner. He seemed distracted, even by his usual standards. Careful with that, Milo said. Do you have any idea what that's worth? Neville stared at him blankly, utter incomprehension evident on his round face. Sorry? What's worth? The salt! It's worth its weight in silver! Milo was aghast that anyone would just pour it into their food, like some sort of condiment. I'm pretty sure you're wrong about that, Neville said, giving him a look that Hogwarts servants reserved for Milo when he exclaimed, "Natural 20!" after a chaser made a particularly impressive goal. Salt's just, well, it's salt. You can get it anywhere. It's on everything. They give it out for free in tiny paper packages at restaurants. It's salt. Wait, you're serious? Milo asked. They just give it away? Of course, it's just salt. Milo blinked. Crafting magic items required a specific value of unspecified materials, so really, anything valuable could work as long as Milo used it up in the production of his gear. However, the price was measured as a gold piece value, not a galleon or muggle currency value. Salt had a fixed price of 5 gold pieces per pound as far as his magic was concerned. But if the local conditions meant that he could get it for a small fraction of that. Ha! Ha! Epilogue 2. Charms Final. Abbott, Hannah. Flitwick called from the front of the room. Hannah shot Milo, Harry, Ron, and Hermione a nervous look and walked to the front of the room, wand clenched with white knuckles. Harry and Ron, on Milo's left, looked somewhat pale and shaky, while Hermione, on his right, was rocking back and forth in her chair, her mouth moving soundlessly at tremendous speed. Of them, only Milo was unconcerned. Pretty much the only spell they'd actually learned in Charms was the Hover Charm, which was, fortunately, one of the few spells that he could actually mimic, more or less. More pressing was the debate of which, if any, prestige class Milo should adopt. Up at the front of the room, Hannah stuttered slightly but managed, in the end, to lift the heavy textbook from the desk and hover it in the air for a few seconds before lowering it to the table. Flitwick, at the front, looked pleased, and Hannah scurried off through one of the side doors. Milo hardly noticed. Paragnostic Apostle has dead easy requirements, Milo mused, but the benefits are so-so. Anastasia Liedon, Milo. I'd have to be a member of the Peristostic Assembly, which doesn't exist here. Or back in Azael, City of Light, City of Magic for that matter. But when it comes down to it, I could probably just paint a sign on the door of my dorm that says, "Welcome to the Peristostic Assembly, new members welcome," and ordain Morty as the exalted philosopher of paragnostic truths. Fluff requirements are so irritating. Milo? Master Specialist isn't bad, but the benefits really don't help me all that much. Besides, it takes spell focus conjuration. Milo had been planning on swapping that out. The locals almost never failed to fail a save as it stood. It was almost as if they didn't even have a will save bonus. Flitwick coughed expectantly. "Oh, right," Milo said absent-mindedly, and tried to walk out of the aisle of students. I might just stay a full wizard then, Milo decided. Morty would chew me out if I dipped into a PRC, which is a prestige class, that didn't advance familiars anyway. He could swap some of his bonus feats for the domain-granted power ability. "Just hover the textbook," Flitwick urged gently. "Yeah, sure, whatever." Milo lazily drew his wand and waved it around more or less at random. Not that the feats wouldn't come in handy. What with all the item crafting I've been doing. He still couldn't believe that he was willingly sacrificing his experience points for anything. Wing Guardian Levitate Osa, he said. With all the close quarters combat that's been happening, maybe I should take some levels of Eldritch Knight. Milo fought down a chuckle. Theoretically, Eldritch Knight only held back spellcasting by 1 level, not including the level in a martial class needed to meet the prerequisites. However, this remained strictly in the hypothetical, as nobody had yet taken 2 levels in Eldritch Knight and lived to talk about it. The last adventurer came close was slain by a kitten in a fair fight. "That," Flitwick said sternly, "was the worst hover charm I have ever seen. Your wand work and footwork. It was sloppy in the extreme. Your incantation was thoroughly botched and put me down this instant." On the other hand, there really had been a lot of fighting. He'd have to see if there were any magic items he could make or spells he could research to increase his combat skills without sacrificing magic. "Oh, right, sorry," Milo said, and dismissed the levitate. Professor Flitwick, who Milo had inadvertently lifted 8 feet off the ground, fell with a crash. The textbook remained on the table, completely unmoved. "In all my years of teaching at Hogwarts, I've only twice seen such... Milo winced as Flitwick drew himself to his full, albeit still tiny, height, brushing dust off of his shoulders. "Such an audacious display of magic from a first-year student at Hogwarts." Flitwick stretched up to Milo's ear and whispered in a conspiratorial manner, "I shouldn't be surprised, if I were you, to find that you'd received an outstanding mark, if you catch my drift." And for those of you who are interested, the very end of this page does explain how Milo made the dedicated rite in all of its munchkinry. I can't believe we're finally done. Not finally, that's not the right word. I can't believe we're actually done. We've been doing this for a long time. And my throat can attest to that. Well, that was interesting. There's some hints and allegations and things left unsaid. There's a lot of questions still to be answered. And I don't think I'm going to continue in this particular book series with the rest of my Fan Fic Fridays. Though I do love Rowan reading, and I am going to continue Fan Fic Friday, I want to open this up so that we can experience more and different varieties of fanfic. So this series, if you would like to continue to read it on your own, should you decide to, is in the chat. The link is in the chat. Thank you all so much for helping us out, for being here with me tonight, for being through this experience. Thank you all so much for listening to me read my favorite fanfic of Harry Potter and D&D, actually. Thank you also to our patrons, because you guys help make all of this craziness possible. And thank you very much to our new patron. You know who you are. Sleeping on a couch, young lady. If you would like to support this channel, either by becoming a patron or by purchasing us a jittery beverage, the links are in the link tree or the about below. So remember, everyone, how much I love you. Because if people can hate for no reason, then I can love for no reason. I truly do love all of you. Thank you so much for being here with me. Thank you for helping me bring the Lumos out to the world. And I hope you all have a really, really splendid long weekend. Bye.